Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Brian Payer. I'm a senior principal here at RMI in our Climate Aligned Industries program, and I lead our Chemicals and Refining Initiative. On behalf of all of my colleagues across Climate Aligned Industries, across RMI, our partners at Breakthrough Energy, and our panelists from Dow and Eastman, honored to welcome you today to our webinar. This is the third and final installment of our summer 2023 Driving Industrial Decarbonization webinar series, so thanks for being here. Why are we doing these webinars? Well, at RMI, it's our mission to drive deep industrial decarbonization across industry, and that means major capital projects, and certainly that is true in the chemicals industry as well. In past webinars, we've covered the package of incentives to unlock, encourage, and accelerate more projects to happen faster and with higher ambition. We've talked about a range of topics from technology readiness levels and life cycle assessments to community engagement, as well as navigating the incentive process. Please do check out the RMI YouTube channel for those past recordings for some great information. And if you are enjoying that content or have any follow-up questions or suggestions, please do follow up with me, and we'd be happy to support you where we can. Because ultimately, we'd like to see you in partnership deliver successful projects that are drastically reducing emissions. So as mentioned, today's focus is the chemicals industry. So we're excited to have a panel to spotlight that, and just want to open up with a couple of housekeeping remarks. One is just a general disclaimer. Today is not covering any specific DOE solicitations or funding opportunities. Please do consult with the DOE website, OSED website, for any information on those, and consult with any legal, tax, or other specialist professionals if you are considering any of those incentives. In today's session, we will have a Q&A. We'll use the Zoom Q&A, so enter those as we go. We'll be monitoring that throughout the session, and we'll have dedicated time at the end to address those questions. The session is going to be recorded, and slides will be made available. So there's lots of info, and we'll look forward to that. Today's a particularly exciting one because we're getting an early look at the preliminary findings of the DOE liftoff report on chemicals. So I am excited to introduce Marisa Brennan to join us here on the stage. Marisa is on the portfolio strategy team at the Department of Energy's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, and she's the lead author of this Chemicals and Refining Pathway to Commercial Liftoff report that will be released here very soon. She leads the financial ecosystem engagement for the team. Prior to DOE, Marisa was a director of innovative finance for the Milken Institute. And prior to that, she worked for different hedge funds. And so she brings a tremendous perspective, and we're thrilled to have her on the virtual stage today. So Marisa, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. Thanks for having us today. We're really excited to be able to share some of our messaging behind the Pathway to Commercial Liftoff, Decarbonizing the Chemicals and Refining report that we are in the very final stages of getting out of the DOE building. So that will be published and made available middle of September. Maybe just as a quick sort of level set, I'll talk through, what we hope to accomplish with this Pathway to Commercial Liftoff report series that the DOE is working on, and then we can definitely dive into some of the specifics around chemicals, and we'll briefly touch on refining because the report does discuss the two sectors together, but understand that the focus here will be the chemicals industry. If we can jump to the next slide, please. Great. So like I mentioned, the upcoming publication of Decarbonizing Chemicals and Refining report is part of a broader DOE Pathways to Commercial Liftoff initiative. Earlier this year, hopefully a few of you have seen, we published wave one of the reports, which covered clean hydrogen, long duration energy storage, advanced nuclear, and carbon management technologies. At DOE, we really feel that the liftoff reports represent a department-wide initiative to strengthen the engagement between the public and private sectors to really accelerate the commercialization and deployment of key clean energy technologies and sectors. The goal of these reports is to provide a common fact base for public and private sector investments and decision-making, to achieve that shared pursuit. In June, we hosted a public webinar that previewed some of the content that will be published in the upcoming days on this set of industrial decarb reports. So today I'm somewhat limited in sharing what's already been made publicly available in June, but rest assured there is 90 pages of deep dive chemicals and refining analysis coming your way over the next couple of weeks, and DOE is keen to engage with all of you across that. If we jump to the next slide. So the upcoming publication of the Decarbonizing Chemicals report is part of a family of industrial decarb reports that we'll be publishing. So there are 3 relevant reports coming out. One is a cross-cutting look at the 8 industrial sectors you see on this slide here. The second is the chemicals and refining deep dive. And then there will be a third report that deep dives into the cement industry. Across all 3 of these reports, we have focused on the decarbonization of processing and production emissions. So you can see the dark green segment, the dark green chevrons on this chart is what we are focused on in the reports. So we are not looking at upstream extraction or downstream end use across any of these sectors. I briefly alluded to a couple minutes ago that the chemicals and refining report, we do look at the 2 sectors together, given that their processes and you can see here, and therefore many of their decarbonization levers do overlap pretty closely. Next slide, please. So to address the in-scope emissions across these sectors, we've identified 9 decarbonization levers of focus. These levers tie directly to DOE's industrial decarbonization roadmap, the pillars that were used in that roadmap, as well as the prior liftoff reports. So we have a very strong mission to make things as clear as possible coming out of the DOE. And so using, similar language across reports and similar assumptions so that the messaging can be very clear over time. The 9 levers here are color-coded based on the industrial decarbonization roadmap pillars that they're representing. So at a very high level, those are carbon capture and storage. I will note that carbon capture and storage here does include hydrogen production with CCS. The second lever is industrial electrification, the third being energy efficiency, and then we sort of have a bucket that is low carbon fuels, feedstocks, and energy sources, which is the lightest green shade here, and you can see what we include as part of that. Finally, we've also estimated the abatement potential of grid decarbonization and demand reduction, because those will have very complementary effects to the decarbonization pathway across these sectors. Next slide, please. You can jump to the next one. So like I mentioned, we will spend the bulk of the time here on the chemicals sector today. At a high level, the chemical sector has the largest share of sector emissions across the 8 sectors that we've looked at. In 2021, CO2e emissions were roughly 3% of the total US, or 315 million tons, which again accounts for roughly 36% of the emissions of the sectors in focus. Chemicals are produced at over 10,000 production facilities across the full value chain, and the production processes vary widely across chemical products. However, that being said, 60% of emissions are attributed to 4 main subsectors, those being natural gas processing, ammonia production, steam cracking for ethylene production, and chlor-alkali processing. And so that is where we have focused the bulk of our work for the upcoming report. One of the interesting figures that will be in the deep dive is that we have done an analysis to break down the emissions associated with each of those subsectors, which we're pretty excited about because that was not analysis that we were able to find anywhere else. And so hopefully that is, very useful information for the market and thinking about, how to decarbonize some of these subsectors. At a more macro level, the industry is highly concentrated. Domestic production of bulk petrochemicals is really led by 5 primary producers who make up roughly 50% of the total US market. And in our analysis, as of April 2023, 10 of the largest 15 chemical companies across the subsectors that we are focused on have made some type of decarbonization commitment. Those generally ranged from 15 to 50% Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions reductions by 2035. We can jump to the next slide. So as you can see on this slide here, chemicals production has fragmented emission sources. The sector emissions really come from three primary areas: heat generation, which is roughly 40%, electricity, which is roughly 29%, and then process emissions are another large chunk at 24%. That remaining other bucket is roughly 7%, and various other sources like fugitive emissions. And while chemicals production has very fragmented emission sources, roughly 80% of these operational emissions originate from on-site point sources, which is really, again, what this report is working to come up with a pathway for decarbonization around. In the deep dive report, we segment out this sort of emission breakdown figure by the four subsectors that I just mentioned. And so, what you'll see is that there's really no magic bullet for abating emissions across the various subsectors because the sources are so heterogeneous. Next slide, please. And because of that heterogeneity and the fragmented nature of the chemical emission sources, the sector will need to pull a variety of abatement levers with definitely significant roles for CCS and equipment electrification powered by clean electricity. Some of these levers are very expensive, and DOE certainly recognizes that. Costs range anywhere from $110 to $140 per ton of CO2e to install CCS on dilute flue gas streams, and all the way up to $145 to $180 per ton of CO2e to add CCS on things like steam cracking furnaces in the ethylene sector. But it's not all bad news, and I think our takeaway should be we cannot let good be the enemy of great. There are levers that are economic and provide a net positive return today that players across the chemicals industry can pull. So those include things like energy efficiency upgrades, like fuel use reduction for ethylene production, and the electrification of natural gas processing compressors. Next slide, please. So in addition to the projected economics, the pathway report considers the current stage of a variety of decarbonization technologies across the industry. So, without the widespread implementation of all of these levers, it's likely that chemicals will continue to be a major contributor to U.S. emissions. The sector emissions could potentially rise by 35% by 2050 in a business as usual pathway, given that the market is growing and we expect it to continue to grow. You can see by the coloring, the color coding here, most companies across the sector are already implementing energy efficiency solutions. Some are making exploratory investments into projects that include things like, decarbonizing production. And this slide, our goal here is to really demonstrate the development stages of levers across the sector. So, for example, ammonia players have expanded plans for clean hydrogen facilities, very much incentivized by the 45Q and 45V tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. However, efficiency and clean hydrogen are only going to address, we estimate 10% of the required abatement for the sector in order to get anywhere close to achieving net zero. So it's really important for the industry to look beyond the levers that are economically viable today and work to be bringing costs down of some of those other levers that are going to be necessary into the 2040s and 2050s. Next slide, please. And so finally, as it relates to the chemical sectors, we have tried to map out what the pathway to net zero could look like across the near, medium, and long term. We have, tried to do this based on industry momentum, available decarbonization levers, and then the current technology maturity. The pathway to decarbonizing U.S. chemical production will definitely need to leverage an entire portfolio of options to reduce its carbon footprint, given that the sector is projected to continue growing and cross-border sales will continue to be essential. In terms of that top band there, technologies that we feel are deployable today include things like the electrification of natural gas processing, producing and using electrolytic hydrogen in ammonia production, again, very much enabled by the 45V tax credit, which is part of IRA, and retrofitting natural gas processing plants with CCS, given the flue stream type. That middle bar is, beyond the decarbonization levers that are being deployed today. What is sort of the next round that the chemical sector will need to deploy? And that's really reaching economies of scale for low temperature heat electrification to get them competitive with fossil fuel boilers and burners, closing the CCS cost gap on more dilute flue streams, and really advancing bio feedstocks for chemicals. There's many others, but we're limited to one slide. And then to achieve a net zero pathway by 2050, the sector will really need to advance alternative steam cracking technologies to be competitive, again, with those that are currently powered by fossil fuels, and more research and advancing alternative production methods will be critical. Next slide. You can jump to the next one. So we've done the same set of analysis for the refining sector, and given the audience's focus, I won't spend quite as much time here. But at a high level, refining is another major contributor to U.S. total emissions. They accounted for roughly 2% of U.S. CO2e emissions in 2021. That pencils out to 242 million tons, which is approximately 27% of the emissions from the sectors in focus for the DOE's industrial decarbonization work. Somewhat similar to chemicals, refining production is very spread out across nearly 130 different refineries nationwide. That being said, more than 40% of capacity is concentrated in the top 5 players. Next slide. We've done a similar mapping to the chemical sector. Refining emissions really come from 3 primary sources. Heat generation, which is a combined 58%, with a significant portion coming from high temperature heat, as you can see here in that dark red shade. Electricity from on-site and off-site power, which is roughly 24%, and then process emissions, which is another 18%. We estimate that approximately 90% of these operational emissions originate from on-site point sources, which is, again, what we are focused on addressing through this work. Next slide. The decarbonization levers with the highest abatement potential across the refining sector really include CCS and industrial electrification. However, as you saw on the previous slide, refineries produce multiple sources of CO2 with very much varying concentrations, which does make decarbonization levers like CCS more complex to implement across these types of assets. Similar to chemicals, the DOE recognizes that these levers are expensive. CCS costs can range anywhere from $80 per ton of CO2e on the low end for capturing more concentrated flue streams, such as those on steam methane reformers, all the way up to $130 a ton at the high end for capturing more dilute flue streams for things like sources of process heat. Again, though, there are positives to take away. It could cost anywhere between $110 to $130 per ton for CO2e for on-site clean electricity and storage after the IRA tax incentives are included. Next slide, please. I won't spend too much time here given the focus, but without widespread implementation of all of these types of decarbonization levers, refining will definitely continue to be a major contributor to U.S. emissions. We estimate that refining emissions could grow 5 to 10% by 2050 in a business as usual scenario. Similar to chemicals, most companies are implementing energy efficiency upgrades, but this only is going to address a very small portion of the emissions that need to be abated across the sector. Next slide. So similarly, we've mapped, what the pathway to commercial liftoff could look like across refining. Over the near term, really installing best available technologies at all 130 major refining locations, producing and using clean hydrogen, and then scaling the production of sustainable fuels. By 2040, which is that middle band there, they'll really need to achieve cost competitiveness in electrifying combined heat and power and close the cost gap on CCS for dilute flue gas streams, again, for things like FCCs and process heat. And then to abate the remaining emissions by 2050, which is that gray bar at the bottom, the refining sector will really need to mature the sustainable fuels that are being made with decarbonized production methods, and more permanently figure out a way to capture emerging green premiums for low carbon fuel products. We also expect that there's a role for modular nuclear to play to compete with fossil fuel powered combined heat and power. And then jump to the last slide. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we have looked at, in the deep dive report, we have looked at the chemicals and refining sectors together. And so our marginal abatement cost curve, or our MAC, which is what you're looking at on the screen here, represents decarbonization levers across both sectors. You can see in parentheses, where which subsector the lever specifically applies to, but just wanted to flag this does refer to both industries. I think the key takeaways here, sometimes these charts can be a little complicated to read, but the goal is to really compare the economics of various technologies that could be used to decarbonize each source of emission. We then select the least cost measure and line up sort of the full suite of measures based on cost to abate. And we used a 10% internal rate of return hurdle in order to justify a net positive lever. So it's important to note, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will mention that, this should not be seen as definitive. It only considers a snapshot in time and one possible set of options based on, the best available information that we have today. This does not necessarily represent the unique set of factors and considerations that each company is going to have to consider when deciding how to decarbonize a facility. But we feel like it's a helpful graphic to display because it can educate the market in understanding the economic challenges for each decarbonization lever and how they compare to all the others. I will also note that there are hundreds of input assumptions that have gone into this analysis. They are all detailed in what we hope is a very clear table in the modeling appendix of the report. So would certainly encourage you to refer there once it's published to see all of the assumptions that have gone into this type of analysis. But the best way to read this is to think about the width of the bar shows the amount of emissions that can be decarbonized through an individual measure. And then the height of the bar represents the cost associated to implement that measure. So the measures on the left side of the chart that are below the line or a negative cost represent measures that will be value accretive to implement. So achieve that 10% IRR or above. And those to the right are get gradually more expensive. We have done 3 versions of this MAC analysis in the deep dive report. So the one you're looking at right now is 2030, including IRA incentives. We also have a version that is 2030 without IRA incentives, and then a 2050 model. Definitely a lot to digest here. I think the high level takeaways are that efficiency upgrades are the most cost additive lever. You can see that narrow dark green bar is at the far left side of the chart. But because it is narrow, that indicates that it doesn't actually abate a considerable amount of emissions. Conversely, CCS on chemical processes like steam crackers for ethylene is a very wide that sort of lime green bar is a wide bar, indicating that there is a high abatement potential. But given that it's at the far right-hand side of the chart, it is the most expensive lever in this model to be pulling. So we are very excited to have all of this work published. Encourage feedback from everyone. If we got it right, we want to hear that. If we got it wrong, we definitely want to hear that as well. So looking forward to getting it out there, and I'll turn it over to Abigail maybe to welcome some of the other panelists.
Thanks so much, Marisa. That was a great presentation, and really excited to lead the discussion, kind of building off what you presented there. So I'll start with some quick introductions for the other panelists here, but I guess before I jump in, I'll introduce myself. I'm Abigail Rajitsky on the Breakthrough Energy U.S. Policy and Advocacy team, and I lead our industrial decarbonization work. So first, we have Billy Barden, who is the Global Climate Transition Director for Dow. He's accountable for the development of Dow's strategy to transition to a carbon neutral future. His responsibilities include engaging Dow's businesses, customers, and external stakeholders on efforts to reduce carbon emissions with a focus on value generation. He leads the coordination, prioritization, and organizational commitment to establish and execute Dow's climate change strategy. Barden leads the Dow Climate Program Management Office and Executive Climate Steering Team. Barden has been with Dow since 2000 and held a variety of global leadership roles across R&D, manufacturing, digital technologies, and climate. In addition to Dow roles, Barden is currently president of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. So thanks for joining us, Billy. Jeff Carbeck is Vice President Corporate Innovation for Eastman Chemical Company. As VP of Corporate Innovation, Dr. Carbeck leads an Eastman team that advances the company's product and materials portfolio through focus on front-end innovation, top innovation programs, and emerging markets. Carbeck started his career in academia at Princeton University, where he was a professor of chemical and materials science for 8 years. He then went on to hold a number of leadership roles in the technology industry, followed by a career at Deloitte, where he built and led a global team helping clients with innovation strategy. Last but not least, we have Chris Poirier, who is a partner at Breakthrough Energy Ventures. Chris has been with BEV since 2017 and has led investments in the manufacturing and buildings and infrastructure space for BEV. Chris sits on the board of directors at AirSeal, Boston Metal, Carbon Cure Technologies, Enverid, Source Global, and Veer, and is a board observer at Pallidus. Over the 25 years prior to joining BEV, Chris started and/or led 6 technology-based companies that span industries that include medical device design and manufacturing, materials development and distribution, design automation software, and energy technology. So thank you all, panelists, for joining us for this conversation today. I'm really excited to dive into the discussion. So again, following the great presentation by Marisa, it would be great to use that as kind of our jumping off point into the discussion. And I know we're all really excited to see the official launch of the reports to really dive deep on some of those details. But based on what Marisa's been able to share, so far, would love to open it up to the panel on initial reactions. Where did DOE get things right? Is there anything they got wrong? Any surprises or things missing? This is one kind of pathway that's been presented, but you all have tons of expertise in this space. So would love to hear your perspectives. Maybe we'll start with Billy.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Abigail. I would like to compliment Marisa and the DOE team on a very extensive preview of the report. I have to say, from Dow's position, we would also agree it will take a myriad of a portfolio of technologies to achieve net zero for our industry by 2050. And looking at the 2030 curves with the cost abatements and all of the options that are out there, I would tell you, from our point of view, we are engaging in some of those technologies that are mentioned in that portfolio, whether it's nuclear or looking at alternative ways to make ethylene. We believe that we will need a suite of options in order to decarbonize our assets and achieve the goals that we put out, which are 5 million metric ton reduction by 2030 and near net zero by 2050 across scope 1, 2, and 3 in our product benefits. So a lot of challenges, a lot of opportunities in this area.
Thanks, Billy. Jeff, what about you next? What do you think?
Certainly the report strongly resonated with me and what we're trying to do at Eastman. One of the things that we're focusing on that isn't as heavily emphasized in the report, I think, because it's largely in an earlier stage, is process technologies that can improve overall carbon emissions. And so at Eastman, what we've done is taken two of our largest streams, our copolyester stream and our cellulose derivative stream, and said, let's start with our big ones and see how we can make those have lower carbon emissions. And it's a big play that we're making. So our process transformation piece is probably one of the larger parts of our overall ambition, which is a little bit unique, where we're also, of course, focusing on energy and efficiency and renewables and alternative feedstocks, but are really pushing hard on the process transformation piece as well. And we're excited to see that be part of the report.
Thanks, Jeff. Chris, want to bring you into this conversation. Sitting at BEV, you'll have a large portfolio of much earlier stage, companies and technologies. So would love to hear from you how BEV's portfolio might align or not with the liftoff's, short-term, medium-term, long-term pathways.
Well, I think certainly it's a highly comprehensive report. And what I'm encouraged by is that it very closely aligns with many of our investment theses across this, not just the chemical space, but the broader industrial decarbonization space. And we do have a portfolio of approximately 120 companies, ranging from very, very nascent technology being spun out of universities, all the way through very late stage, fully commercial and readily available technologies. And it was very encouraging to see some of the areas of suggested investment and abatement opportunities that align with some of our existing portfolio companies. So it's encouraging, and it's also a strong endorsement for I think our general thesis in terms of decarbonizing the broader industrial space as well as the chemical space.
That's great.
Maybe I'll just build on that. So in the cross-cut industrial decarb report that we are working on, I think one of the key takeaways there is there are, heat, for example, is a problem area across all 8 subsectors. And so, what are the technologies that we can try to, as a DOE, advance that will address issues, across multiple sectors, because there are certain emission profiles that are maybe not consistent across all 8, but certainly relevant across a majority, where you can, kill multiple birds with the same stone, so to speak.
Thanks, Marisa. Yeah, it'll be great to see kind of the compilation or family of all of those industrial decarb reports come out and really see kind of the linkages between all these subsectors. But it sounds like so far, at least, initial reactions are positive. So great job to you and your team on putting together the chemicals and refining, liftoff report. And like I said, I'm sure many more conversations to come once those details come out, and maybe future more arguments can be made on, cost and some of those footnotes and things. But great to see that it seems that things are pretty aligned with, the industry's view. Kind of continuing to build off the report, there were several technology levers that are highlighted there that, Billy and Jeff, you've already mentioned that your companies are thinking about. So would love to dig a little deeper on those and some of the projects that, are already in motion. So maybe we'll start with you, Jeff. You mentioned, the process technologies that you all are really focused on. So would love to hear, any more that you'd like to say on that and kind of current state and, how that's going, as well as some of the things that Eastman has been leading on, advanced recycling and really leaning on that kind of process efficiency, alternative feedstocks, and how you think those levers are going to be, playing in Eastman's portfolio.
Absolutely, yeah. A few things I'll start with. So first of all, things like clean hydrogen, we have to do that, right? Like most chemical companies, a big part of our transformation of materials starts with things that have to be hydrogenated. So we need hydrogen as a feedstock, and right now that comes from natural gas. And so clearly that's an opportunity for the entire industry to think about, how to tackle a big part of our overall emissions, and we can share best practices in that arena, at least in areas that are pre-competitive. And I think that's a really important opportunity. The two processes that I mentioned, like I said, are both kind of built off of our two key feedstock streams, at least here in our Kingsport, Tennessee facility. So we've been making copolyesters for decades. We've started making PET for drink bottles, and of course have moved upstream into higher value plastics. But the unique thing about these materials is that the chemistry can run in two directions, right? So you can run the chemistry forward and make the plastic out of small molecule monomers. You can run the chemistry backwards and recover those monomers and use them as feedstocks for making the same material, making different materials. And so that's become a big part of our advanced recycling. We plan to commission and launch a $250 million plant here in Kingsport to do that, with a steady state operation of roughly 100,000 metric tons of plastic that difficult to recycle otherwise. They'll end up as raw feedstock and replace traditional fossil fuels as feedstocks for those materials. So that's an example of something that we're doing at scale. The other stream I mentioned was our cellulose esters. For almost 100 years, we've been taking wood pulp and modifying it chemically to make all sorts of products, including all the film that used to go into Kodak products. So those materials are still with us today. And one of the things our team has figured out how to do is make those materials not only bio-based, coming from wood feedstocks, but also biodegradable. And now we can even make compostable articles like this cutlery out of this material. What's really advantaged is it's already at scale. So we're already making hundreds of thousands of metric tons of that material every year for other applications. And now we've figured out a way to formulate it into a compostable solution. The other part that's exciting for us is, again, older technology. In the 70s, during the energy embargo, we converted a lot of our feedstocks from petrochemicals to coal. So we were one of the few places in the world that does coal to liquid transformations by gasifying coal. Well, it turns out you can also run those gasifiers on waste plastic that you can't recycle. It's a good source of carbon for our gasifiers. And so we're running mixed gasification right now that allows us to put waste plastic into compostable materials. It's a little bit hard unless you really get into the fundamental chemistry, how that all works. But it's an example of how, rather than trying to start something totally new and try to figure out how to scale it all the way through piloting and prototyping, saying, what are the big assets we have today that if we could figure out how to make them operate in a different way, could we really move the needle? And by taking that approach, we found some really exciting opportunities to have actually big impact on our carbon footprint by looking at some of our biggest processes and largest volume materials. So that's not the only path, right? There's lots of other paths, but those are two that we're pursuing at Eastman. One thing I'll just say to Chris is, having come from the startup world, where I spent about a decade, we would love to figure out how to partner and take some of the technologies that the companies that you're investing in and help think about scale. When I was in that world, scaling and the access to capital to scale was one of the hardest things. And I think industrial partners can be a really great opportunity to do that. And we're certainly already engaged in that in a certain way, but I think it's a big opportunity for us to work together on.
Absolutely. And it's absolutely critical to our ecosystem to establish partnerships with companies like Eastman and Dow. We have an entire within Breakthrough Energy, as Abigail can attest. We have an entire group called our partnerships group, and also within BEV, we have a strong working group around establishing core partnerships for our portfolio companies in order to achieve that adoption and then ultimately scale those technologies so that they can maximize their impact. So that's something that we are constantly working on and working with, and partnerships are absolutely critical to that success. And I look along some of the things that you had just mentioned. Some of our portfolio companies have developed methodologies for converting CO and CO2 into ethylene using low temperature electrolysis. We have what we think a best in class technology to depolymerize lignin versus the biorefineries that focus primarily on cellulose and hemicellulose. And then we've also got a company called Electric Hydrogen, which has hit the press recently with a very large fundraising, $380 million, which is really leading, through a PEM cell electrolysis process, the production of green hydrogen. So that's just a short list of companies within our portfolio that are at or reaching sort of the commercial inflection point.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff and Chris, for your perspectives. Yeah, I would love to turn it over to Billy to hear kind of the Dow perspective. And I think two projects in particular that folks, may have likely heard of in your Seadrift facility in Texas, as well as the planned net zero ethylene facility in Alberta, which I think involves, again, many of the technologies and levers mentioned in the liftoff report, but would love to hear a bit more about, those projects, as well as how Dow thinks about, which technologies to kind of put together at any given site to really accomplish your goals.
Yeah, appreciate that, Abigail, and thanks for the opportunity. Again, if you look at our portfolio and our approach to circularity and to carbon mitigation, we are looking throughout the value chain, and we have quite a significant number of projects all the way from renewable material-based plastics packaging, polyols, and sustainable solutions on the customer end, to big asset upgrades and new process technology on the feedstock end, which you referenced. I can start with our Seadrift project, which is in partnership with X-Energy and the Department of Energy through the ARDP, Advanced Reactor Development Program, looking at advanced small modular nuclear technology. And this will be the first instance of integrating a small modular nuclear reactor advanced technology with the integrated chemical manufacturing, material manufacturing facility. We announced that our site for this test and implementation will be in Seadrift, Texas. And it will provide, to Marissa's point in her discussion, she was talking about process heat. It will provide both heat and power. So heat or steam, as well as electricity to the site. And that's, for us in the process industries, I think, a critical requirement. We're not just looking for electricity. We're not just looking for low quality heat or low pressure steam. We need, if we're going to drive some of our asset base, we need high pressure steam. We need high quality heat, as well as the power to supply to the site. And so advanced small modular nuclear technology offers that opportunity. We're excited about the implementation we have planned. Of course, a lot of technology development to be required. We have to work on fuels, of course, which DOE is helping to go after that component. It will give us a chance to potentially decarbonize other assets at the site, building off of that infrastructure. We have, with just the reactor itself and the steam and power capabilities, about 440,000 tons of CO2 mitigation that will happen. And then obviously this is a first of the kind deployment. So we have to think about what comes next after that. How do we manage second, third, fourth, fifth builds around the nuclear technology? How do we prove it out? There's a lot of capability development that's going to be required, looking at how we integrate and do advanced process optimization between the nuclear facility and the materials, chemicals manufacturing facility. So very challenging, very exciting. I never thought I would see a point in my career where Dow would be deploying an advanced small modular nuclear reactor on its site. We've talked about it a few times over the different decades in my career, but obviously this is a chance to really go do that at scale. You also mentioned our Fort Saskatchewan ethylene facility, which is going to be one of the world's first net zero ethylene production facilities. And here we're using hydrogen basically as fuel for cracker technology for ethylene production, as well as for power generation. So reforming combined with carbon capture and sequestration. So again, another one of the technologies in the portfolio that Marissa mentioned in the liftoff report summary. And that will allow us to produce ethylene with a low carbon footprint. It will decarbonize actually more than 20% of Dow's global ethylene footprint just in that one facility. More than 1 million metric tons a year of carbon sequestered that will be generated at that location, and provide us and low carbon polyethylene and low carbon packaging solutions to provide to our customers. So very large world scale types of deployments. Both of those sites are major manufacturing facilities for Dow. And then we have, of course, lots of other technologies that we're developing in the process space, whether it be our advanced ethylene technology, EDH, ethylene dehydrogenation technology that's on the far end, or we have an e-cracking program with Shell as a joint development partner that will allow us to explore and potentially commercialize the electrified ethylene production facility. And for us, our ethylene and power plants are our most significant sources of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions around the company. We decarbonize those assets, we go a long way to decarbonizing Dow's manufacturing footprint. So very exciting times, and this whole portfolio approach allows us to have different options, a different technology that will fit a particular situation. One of the things that we focus on, of course, is how we pay for that. Marissa mentioned the IRA and the subsidies, as well as trying to generate economic returns. If we can't do that and still make a return for our shareholders, it becomes very difficult for us to stay in business. So we go with the mantra of decarbonize and grow. So we're growing our asset base, we're growing our product portfolio, we're increasing our volume of capability for production at the same time that we're decarbonizing the assets and decarbonizing our power generation facilities. But we think hydrogen has to be in there, renewable power, so solar, wind, where we now have over a gigawatt of renewable contracts under in use in our facilities around the world. So hydrogen, renewable power, nuclear, alternative process technologies, all of these are going to be required to meet the challenges that we are facing as an industry.
I'm just going to say, we love to see you tackling those real expensive MAC curve levers.
Yeah, the ethylene is on the far right of your chart.
Exactly.
So it's a difficult challenge. It is even with the incentives, one of the more costlier portions of the decarbonization MAC curve or available opportunities. We've been working on energy efficiency a long time. We've been working on renewables a long time. We know we're going to have to go after those hard to abate technologies to make our goals achievable.
Yeah, really great to hear all your perspectives and hear about, real projects that are happening that are developing these technologies. Billy, you kind of referenced, this is some of the things you're talking about are first of a kind, but really you also need to start playing for that second, third, fourth, fifth, nth of a kind for, these things to really get to scale, which is a lot of the focus of, the report from DOE. So I'd love to hear from you all about what you're thinking about these early projects and their ability to scale. What are the challenges that you're facing, that you anticipate, that you might face as you try to scale? What are the ways that you can kind of mitigate those things? And maybe actually we can start with Marissa, given all of the information you all have gathered through writing of this report, and since, scaling and liftoff is such a critical piece of what you all were trying to tackle, any insights that you can provide on this kind of scaling question in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we certainly recognize that these technologies today are very expensive, and understand your point, Billy, that as a company with shareholders, as much as I'm sure you would like to decarbonize out of the goodness of your heart, that's, not what shareholders are necessarily looking for. And so, these technologies have to be viable investment opportunities in order for them to be, achieve the scale that is actually going to be meaningful across the sector. So I think, at OSED, we are very focused on, our whole mandate is commercialization, and how can we provide DOE funding to help bring down some of that first of a kind risk, so that, we're able to prove out the concept at a scale that hasn't been done before, at, demonstration phase size projects, so that ultimately, some of those risks are, they're probably not going to be eliminated, but significantly reduced, so that private investors, whether it be corporate or other financial entities, feel comfortable coming in and taking on those risks, and they are more quantifiable risks that can be, factored into an investment portfolio, so that it's not a first of a kind and a first of a kind only project. We really do, our mission is to get these technologies to nth of a kind, both from a cost perspective and from a just larger, commercialization availability perspective.
Yeah. Open up to, the rest of the panel jump in on this kind of scaling question, and thoughts on, what would really be helpful to your companies as you think about scaling. Hey, Jeff, we can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, couple of comments. So one is, and I'm sure Billy, you'll resonate with this. I mean, as large, chemical companies that have been around a while, we're used to running on fully depreciated assets, right? So it's a whole mentality shift in going from I've got this asset in the ground, how do I get the most production and the most efficiency and yield out of it, which is what most of the companies like Eastman certainly have been thinking about primarily for decades and decades. So we're really good at that. Building a brand new plant and then figuring out a business model that's different than it was before, because you're now trying to engage in some sort of circular business engagement with your customers, your customers' customers, to justify that capital investment is just, I mean, everybody has to think differently, from your CFO and your investors all the way through your operations people. And it's a big transformation for an industry culture that I think we need to recognize that goes beyond the technology and the regulations. I mean, our industries actually have to fundamentally reinvent and rethink how we invest capital, how we put capital to use, and how we think about return on that investment. And I think it's a really exciting time, but it's very different, and we need new thinking and new engagement on that. A second thing I would say, and this is maybe something more specific to some of the things that we're doing, but you get in the advanced recycling arena, and your feedstock is no longer a specified material that you can purchase on futures markets and have contracts with, right? You're tapping into a municipal waste stream essentially, and so the reliability of that, the consistency of it, it's incredibly variable. So it's another sort of set of unit operations, to put it in the context of chemical engineering, that we need to develop to think about how we used alternative feedstocks, whether it's bio-based or whether it's waste plastic. These all come with a totally different way of thinking about your feedstock as an energy plant. So we, for example, are building a mixed plastics recovery facility here at Eastman. So even though we can bring in what we would call relatively clean streams from, say, a mechanical recycling perspective, we actually further process and bin those in a variety of ways to make them more amenable to our kind of advanced recycling. And so I think there needs to be a whole set of skills and abilities to deal with these kinds of alternative feedstocks that aren't traditional chemical industry skills and capabilities. So there's a lot of new opportunity in these areas, but I think they reflect a lot of challenges that we probably didn't fully appreciate until we actually started to do some of these things at scale. And so it's changing the capabilities and the talent pool, even of the people that we're hiring to build these plans, to think through our financial strategy, to think through our commercial strategy, thinking through partnerships. How do you partner with consumer products companies to help them on their circularity journey? How do you tie into their scope 3 emissions and help our customers think through all of that? So beyond just making our plant inside the fence more efficient, we recognize we're playing a role in a broader ecosystem that's also going through the same kind of transformations. And it's exciting, but it's a very different culture and a very different operating model than I think we've been used to in this industry, certainly.
Yeah, I think Jeff is correct. The engagement required throughout the complete value chain is different. We've always engaged with our customers, trying to understand where their problems are or where the opportunities would be for us to bring them an innovative solution, to bring them a product that is advantaged and it will help them advance their goals. Now it's not only just feeding them product, but as Jeff correctly points out, if you want to close the loop on plastic circularity, for example, you need to understand, and they need to understand, what they're sending back to you as a feedstock, not just a one-way transport from us to them of product any longer. And that's a critical new link in the value chain, especially around many of our product lines in the plastics or packaging space or in the polyurethanes arenas. And so trying to figure out the economics of that, trying to understand what is the value of carbon-free or low-carbon product in the market and monetizing that, trying to have policies or principles in place that allow us to have a real carbon market or carbon pricing that helps justify economics or justify investment. Those are things that we need to develop. And Jeff mentioned the new skill sets. I think the the workforce development components that are required in order to move into a whole economy based on hydrogen or based on recycled feedstock or some sort of combination of those skill sets are different, both from the engineer and the executive and the finance level down to the process operator level. And so we have opportunities to upskill, uptrain, and uplift the workforce in the local communities and where we work. That has to be part of the program. Of course, that is part of the program for many of the DOE and current administration and initiatives. I think on the process side of the house, de-risking, the investments we're making, I mentioned earlier, are significant. They're world scale, but they're based on adjacencies to technologies that we know today. When you get to things that are radically different, that's where you have much lower technology readiness levels, where innovation funding, kind of greasing the skids of getting past a demo plant or a pilot plant and into something that's commercially viable is important. We, of course, would like to see more of that.
Great. Yeah, Chris, do you have anything to add to the scaling, especially on kind of maybe those more emerging technologies and what's really going to help in that space?
Yeah, I really like the comments that both Billy and Jeff made around circularity and integrating new technology and finding new ways to engage with the entire value chain. Those are the things that we hunt for, that we're looking for on a much earlier scale or much earlier stage, and ultimately working with folks like yourself and understanding some of the challenges that you're facing from a technical standpoint, and finding the technologies that can fill those gaps and underwriting that technology risk is what we do. And so we're always looking for that problem that needs to be solved, because we're very good. We're a technology-driven organization. We're a deep tech investor, and we have a very solid working knowledge of the technologies in which we invest, and also the processes into which they can be integrated. And it's going to take partnerships between companies like our portfolio companies, our team, our investment team, and your teams, to identify opportunities where you see a large a larger opportunity, but yet lack the specific technology to crack the problem. Mm-hmm. That's where we'd like to sort of stick our nose in there and get our hands dirty, and underwrite some very early stage technology that can possibly solve those problems and unlock those opportunities.
Chris, you're in the startup space. We've talked a lot about the process technologies and scaling those, but we shouldn't omit the sort of back office technologies that are also required when you think about system of record and carbon ledgers and the ability to track and trace and validate. And of course, at least I know for Jeff and me and probably Chris, some of your portfolio companies, the reporting requirements that are coming from low carbon technologies or any of our sustainability portfolio, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in that arena as well, to go along with supporting the actual materials preparation and production. You need the back office financial and carbon track and trace capabilities out there too.
Yeah, and many of our companies, especially some of our later stage companies, have gone into it with that forethought and actually developed systems that are integrated into the processes and the technologies, where they're collecting that data in real time in order to provide critical information in the form of environmental product declarations and things of that nature. But that's part of the solution. You may have an underlying technology that allows you to convert CO or CO2 into ethylene, but you also have the forethought where, hey, we're going to have to collect a lot of data from this in order to provide information for reporting on those scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions that are related with these processes. And so a lot of our companies have that although we're not an IT investor per se, almost all of our companies are aware that is and will continue to be and will accelerate the demand for that information and organizing it and presenting it in a way that allows us to truly track and trace and be accountable for the reductions in that we're actually creating.
Yeah, that's such an important piece to all of this. And I'm going to pull on this string just a little bit more until before switching to audience Q&A. So just a reminder to our audience, please continue inputting questions now, and we'll switch to that soon. But I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper and kind of get us into a bit of a policy discussion. Policies, already come up in many ways in how, current policies are already, hopefully going to be reducing costs for some of these technologies, as presented by Marisa. But really on this kind of accounting, how do you actually prove that you have a lower carbon product? And alongside that, then how do you create the markets and the demand for those products? Jeff, you mentioned, really working with other pieces of the value chain, companies like consumer product companies. So would love to just ask this last moderated question to the group on what you think can be done on kind of those demand side market creating policies, both from, the perspectives of the industry and then Marisa as well. I know, DOE and OSED are thinking about the demand side as well. And if you have any thoughts to share there. So Jeff, I know you came off mute there if you wanted to start.
Eager to jump in. Yeah, I mean, kind of building off of the last set of comments for Billy and Chris. One of the things we rely very heavily on is supply chain traceability, right? So if our customers buy a material from us and we say it's got 30% recycled content in it, if you do mechanical recycling, it's pretty easy, right? You just know that 30% of what goes in one end comes out the other end, and you nailed it, right? When you're doing it at a integrated chemical facility, you can't trace individual carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms around. And so what you have to do is use something like a mass balance approach, and then integrate that into your audit system around your supply chain. And so, not only do we have to be able to do that and have materials that are certified to contain that content from a mass balance perspective, our customers also then have to become certified so that when they sell their product to their consumers and they label it as 30%, post-consumer recycled content, that they can certify that. And so there's this whole certification body and regulations around things like mass balance that sound really, really in the weeds. But if we really want to, we believe if you really want to drive advanced recycling and this kind of approach to circularity, we have to understand why this is a valuable approach, make sure that our law makers understand why it's valuable, and build consumer confidence that they truly are. If they think they're paying for a sustainable product that has recycled content in it, they're actually getting that value that they're paying for. In some ways, it's no different than our electricity grid, right? Where people can buy renewable energy. They're not actually buying those actual electrons that come from, a solar panel. But if you do the balance right, you can account for it in an appropriate way, and you can make sure that the consumers can make that choice. So it's a complexity that oftentimes doesn't get fully realized when people are passing laws about what we should do with plastic waste and other things. But it's actually a really important dimension to this, and it requires IT, information technology to track. It requires a different way of thinking about the value of your materials. It leads to circularity discussions with your customers. So there's a lot of power behind it, but it's also something that we're just really beginning to understand and really integrate into things like regulation.
Yeah, we look for in the policy space things that will add stability, basic carbon pricing infrastructure. If we're going to do CCS as a global entity or a national entity, there needs to be infrastructure there to support that. The ability to get permitting done with speed and with a highly effective resourcing in the permitting arena would be helpfully beneficial. I mentioned already driving programs that drive innovation that help bring new process technologies to markets. Those are all key levers that we would see as advantages in the policy space, and making sure that we continue to educate both our leadership as well as our consumer and society around the interplays of low carbon versus circularity versus water and biodiversity. You don't get all of it. They're all interconnected. You don't get them for free. There's always trade-offs to be had in trying to optimize the entire ecosystem around what's good for the environment and for society versus how we can effectively and competitively manage and manufacture materials that are needed by society.
From the DOE side, we definitely recognize there's a role that we can play to shore up some of the demand side components to certain markets. You may have seen DOE issued a RFI, request for information, around trying to organize a hydrogen demand side mechanism. And so, we understand that it's very hard for companies to purchase a commodity that is not yet produced at a price that is not yet fully solidified. And so, is there a role? What role can DOE play to help, again, eliminate some of those risks and create some level of demand certainty, given that, things like hydrogen will be such a key lever to unlock to decarbonize industry. I think, less relevant for the chemical space, but for certain industrial processes like cement, the federal government is a huge buyer of end use product. And so, what role can we play in normalizing a green premium for products that are, made with a lower carbon intensity? And so we are definitely actively thinking about, how DOE can help on the demand side of things, whether it's price, buying, quantities, et cetera. Open to any feedback if there's other areas where you think, over the near term, we can play an active role.
Thanks all for your thoughts there. I think with that, we're going to turn into our audience Q&A, and keep them coming if you still have questions. Our first question is for Chris. And the question is whether you can talk a little bit more about TRL and general state of electrochemical processes to produce primary chemicals, as opposed to maybe the more conventional, energy intensive thermochemical processes.
I can get into a little bit of that. I'm one of our lesser technically savvy team members, so you all have the benefit of or pleasure of speaking to the dumbest guy at Breakthrough Energy Ventures. So many of my fellow partners are PhDs and have technical degrees, and I've been rejected from most of the schools where they got those degrees. So including where Jeff had a tenure at Princeton. So I'll try to keep it high level. We're stage agnostic investors, so we invest across a broad spectrum of stages. So from the very, very earliest idea and concept stage, all the way through our new growth fund and into growth stage opportunities that are theoretically at scale, not at Dow scale, not at Eastman scale, but at scale where there isn't a green premium. And I think there is, our organization does reference the green premium and the need to address that quite often. But if you look throughout our portfolio, many of the companies, many of the technologies and solutions that we've invested in do not command a green premium. They don't, even at modest scale. And so that's a little bit of a misconception, I think, that needs to be adjusted. In terms of TRL levels for these electrochemical processes, we're seeing everything from 1 to, at the higher end, 5 or 6. All right, and so and it's accelerating nicely because we're forming partnerships. We're getting incentives through the IRA, and there's lots of capital pouring into the climate technology space to support scaling these technologies and maturing these technologies. So that's accelerating quite nicely and to the benefit of our portfolio in general in our fund. But we're not afraid of investing in low TRL technologies that have the promise, as long as they have the promise of reaching, full commercial scale without a green premium. I believe that there's got to be a commercial, a beneficial use case for every technology that we invest in, and it has to be looked at without consideration of incentive or or any other non-dilutive capital type additionality to the economics. Because if it can stand on its own without a green premium, that'll drive adoption, and that adoption will continue to accelerate and pull that through to the largest scale as possible, so that we can make that impact. So we look at the incentives that are available as an upside, and try to make investments in companies that don't necessarily need incentives to drive the profits that are necessary for returns, either for our portfolio companies, for our fund, or for our partners like companies like Dow and Eastman.
Thanks, Chris. Next for Bill or Jeff, thinking beyond just your current assets and how you're decarbonizing those sites. When you think of a future chemicals facility, what needs to be true for that to be sited for access to renewable electricity? How do you think about those greenfield sites of the future?
I guess I can maybe take a stab at it. We're not thinking about siting particularly next to renewable facilities. I mean, we today, as I mentioned earlier, we have over a gigawatt of renewable power helping to power our facilities, providing electricity to our facilities. And so we're able to transport that through the mechanism that Jeff elucidated with renewable energy credits or certificates to be able to have electrons that are associated with solar, wind, hydroelectric, for example, and use those in our facilities. I think you have to balance, as you think about greenfield builds, you need to balance the opportunity around feedstock, logistics and transport, local workforce, what you have available both for construction of said facilities as well as long-term operation. They may not necessarily line up where the sun shines all the time or the wind blows more. And so there's a lot that goes into actually siting a facility and making sure that it is a viable location. That's where things like nuclear, for example, offer opportunities to go into areas that are not necessarily high in solar capability or high in wind capability or hydroelectric capabilities. I don't know, Jeff, if you had more to add.
I mean, from my sort of simplistic view on it, it's almost always less expensive and more efficient to build where you already are, because you take advantage of existing heat, steam, power, all of those things. And so going and building a greenfield facility is daunting, and oftentimes hard to justify, not because of the primary advantage you might get from siting, say, close to a renewable energy source, but the loss in efficiency you have from not being integrated with the rest of the plant. So it's very much a challenge for us when we think about siting. And so instead, exactly as Billy indicated, we need to start to think about how we both integrate into existing renewable energy sources, as well as invest locally in our plants where we can to achieve that. And it's a big challenge. And I agree that it's exciting, I think, to finally see the industry embracing nuclear power again as one solution to that. I think that's going to have to be some part of our solution, certainly within the industry, along with many others. And we're just, I think, starting to think about those kinds of questions. Right now, we're dealing with our existing facilities and thinking about how do we make them most efficient, reduce their carbon emissions. How do we integrate new technology into the existing facilities to achieve those objectives? And then I think greenfield would be sort of the next phase of that whole activity.
Yeah, you have to, Jeff mentioned it, it's hard to overcome the economics when you have fully depreciated assets. And if you're building in a brownfield location, there's lots of infrastructure to support new facilities of which you can take advantage.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
One of the things that we're also doing is we're investing in the infrastructure necessary to deliver those electrons, right? And to deliver those resources. So we've got investments in superconducting transmission infrastructure technologies that will allow you to deliver more and more power, not just to large petrochemical company facilities, but also to the growing data center demand and things that require incredible amounts of power. How do you get, and God forbid, we've got investments in modular fusion within our portfolio, and God forbid it works. How are you going to get those electrons from point A to point B when your current grid is completely insufficient? And so we have to think about not just generating that power or delivering or having access to green energy, but also delivering it from point A to point B. And so it really does take a holistic view of what it's going to take to achieve these climate goals in order to make it a reality.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's a great point as well. We have to take that systems level perspective, and all these things are definitely connected. And maybe in the future, world that we will have all that transmission and clean generation build out. And so you don't even necessarily have to think, about siting right next to where, some renewables make sense or not. Marisa, here's a question for you related to the report. How are future demand potentials for refined petroleum products and natural gas considered? If EVs take off, we'd expect reduced demand for motor fuels. If building and industrial electrification grows greatly, we'll expect reduced natural gas end use demand and reduced natural gas processing. How did you all think about that?
Yes, it is definitely a big factor. You will have seen on the MAC curve, from the 533 million tons, we only account for a certain percentage, and a big part of the abatement is getting to a decarbonized grid and demand reduction. And so those factors are certainly taken into consideration. As it relates to the pathway towards refining, we are assuming that, the White House meets its long-term EV strategy by 2035. That there are, that we do achieve, 80% grid decarbonization by 2030, I think it is. Don't quote me on these numbers. They're in an appendix. But those are definitely very key factors in order to get these two sectors to net zero. And you'll see in the report, even with the grid grid decarbonization, demand reduction, and all of the decarbonization levers that we lay out, there's still 7% of emissions that, with today's technologies, we can't figure out how are going to be abated. And that's, if everyone does everything everywhere all at once. And so those sort of macro factors are definitely very heavily factored into the report.
Thanks for that. Back to Jeff or Billy. How do the next generation of chemical projects integrate safe transportation of products into its planning and stakeholder engagement? For instance, contributions to rail infrastructure upgrades. For either of you to take the first step.
I think probably the same for Jeff. And our first and foremost option is not to transport. We keep the chemicals that need to be used as intermediates within sites as much as possible. We look at what we call it molecular tourism, of shipping around of various materials from site to site to site to ultimately get to an end product. So we are working to reduce the amount of unnecessary transportation required for intermediate processing, for example. So that gets back to this idea of using integrated sites and using the capabilities we have available at a large location to complete processing and then ship an ultimate product. Obviously, we in the industry, we need to see safe rail transport or safe and effective rail transport. We need to have systems in place to help ensure that products are handled appropriately on the rail. we would certainly be advocating for those types of investments.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I agree 100% with all that. The idea of trying to keep as much of your intermediates in your fence is obviously another, as Billy articulated, another reason why we like the integrated facility approach. One of the things that we're looking at, I think it's a broader topic than what we just talked about, is just the whole issue around persistence of the things that we make. I think as an industry, we have to become much more aware of what is the end of life for everything we make, and do we really understand it, and can we be accountable for what happens to the products that we make, or the intermediates that we make that unfortunately sometimes do get out in the environment. And so I think looking at that whole supply chain through that lens of as an industry, we have a responsibility for making stuff that's not going to be persistent and in the environment is going to be an important part of our overall sustainability strategy. So it obviously touches on the question about the specific intermediates, but I think it's more broadly about what the industry responsibility is going to be going forward in terms of what happens to the things we make when they enter the environment.
Thanks you both for that. Back to Marisa, a question related to the report. Could you go a bit into the difference between concentrated versus dilute streams in terms of CCS challenges and approach? And what are the challenges with each? What is the likelihood of each being deployed, since those were kind of broken out in the report?
Yes, similar to Chris, I'm going to plead the not chemical engineering background on this response. But as it relates to concentrated flue streams, there is less filtering technology that needs to be put in place. And so it's an easier stream of CCS to capture, and therefore slightly cheaper. On dilute flue streams, it's more than just carbon coming out. And so, the various outputs need to be separated and concentrated and captured separately. And so it's just naturally more expensive. I believe in the report, we've considered anything below a 90% concentration. 90% is where we delineate the concentrated versus dilute flue stream line. And so, yeah, that's how we've, there are processes today like natural gas processing that has very concentrated carbon flue streams. And that is why CCS, we bucket into the deployable category there. Process heat, which has, disparate flue streams sort of across refining assets, is, just a much more complex installation of CCS, and therefore much more expensive.
Got it. Any other thoughts on kind of CCS and those differences, or can, I think, get to one last question before we have to wrap up? All right. So in most decarbonization pathways, the chemical sector seems to be the likely last consumer of oil and gas. What unique opportunities does this offer the sector to incentivize near-term methane cuts and broader decarbonization? Maybe this could go to Billy or Jeff and Marisa, if you have thoughts as well. That's kind of, bringing the two, chemicals and refining, together.
Yeah, I mean, I'll maybe just speak briefly on this. I mean, one of the advantages of bringing in oil, gas, coal, other fossil fuels into an integrated chemical site is you can deal with the emissions much more readily and easily, as opposed to in a distributed emission scenario like transportation fuels, right? And so even as we develop electric vehicles, you have to look at the source of the electricity, even if it's generated with in an intermediate state. Fossil fuels point sources are always much easier to capture and utilize and sequester. So, I think what we need to do in the chemicals industry specifically is to think about that as an advantage, right? So if we are going to have to use, and we always will have to use some amount of fossil fuels in the production of the, pharmaceuticals and materials that we need to survive as a society. Let's do it in a way where we think through the whole carbon cycle, and take advantage of integrated chemical facilities that we can actually capture that and utilize it or sequester it in a very centralized way. So I think that's part of the reality that we have to deal with, and makes our carbon neutrality challenge even bigger. Right, we'll never stop using some amount of those fossil fuels and materials, at least not for a long time, until we figure out how to completely recycle at the molecular level everything we make. And I believe that that's ultimately viable, but we have to understand the time it's going to take to get there, and have a really robust bridging strategy where those fossil fuels still play a role.
Yeah, I think that's right. For us in the materials industry, the fossil feedstocks, as I like to call them, is important. We have a portfolio of solutions and energy solutions that help enable our goals. We also, for, as Jeff said, a long time to come, we'll have a portfolio of feedstocks, whether that be fossil based, whether it be post-consumer recyclate, biomaterials. And so being able to mix those, being able to have access to all of those feedstocks is important for our industry to be successful and supply the products that we need as a human society.
I think, yeah, the only thing I would add, and hopefully this messaging comes through in the report, we certainly recognize that there are opportunities for feedstock material substitution. So, we don't at all ignore biofuels or biofeedstocks or carbon oxide feedstocks or anything like that. But they are, they play a much bigger role when you're looking at full life cycle emissions, or rather than just in the fence process emissions. And so what we've tried to do with the report is recognize that hydrocarbons and fossil fuels will continue to be a major feedstock provider for these industries. And so assuming that sort of stays the same for the majority of cases, what are the technologies and decarbonization levers to help the facilities achieve net zero, even with a pretty significant fossil fuel feedstock portfolio.
Great, thanks, Marisa. And I'm sure everyone will be glad to dive in again to the full report to see all of that in great detail. Well, with that, I'd love to thank all of the panelists today for joining us, and turn it over back to Brian to close us out.
Well, thank you very much, Abigail. Hearty thank you and gratitude to our panelists, Billy, Jeff, Chris. Thank you very much. Thank you to Marisa for walking us through and giving us the sneak preview on the report. We will look forward to that and have some light reading here in our near future. Thank you very much, Abigail, our moderator. Thank you for the partnership, Breakthrough Energy team, for making these webinar series possible. Kudos to our production team behind the scenes for making this all happen, getting us organized, keeping us going. And thank you very much to the audience for being here today. A couple housekeeping items in closure. Yes, the recording will be available on the RMI YouTube channel. Give us a few days to get that posted and cleaned up. Second, the slides will be available for the DOE liftoff report coming very soon at liftoff.energy.gov. And finally, just from the RMI Chemicals and Refining team, we are thrilled to offer this content to you. It's a small portion of the work that we do. We are driving on emissions visibility from the chemicals and refining industry. We are working hard to get first of a kind projects to happen so that we can get the first of a kind, then to the nth of a kind projects moving. And we're working in the sectors of market activation and aggregating demand, supporting mechanisms for climate differentiated products. Many of the topics that were discussed today, we support that with policy levers, finance mechanisms, and we work across the ecosystem with the policymakers, research and development organizations, incumbents, innovators, and insurgents. We're looking forward to doing a chemicals focused cohort through our partnership with Third Derivative over the coming year or two. So this is many more things. If any and all of these things are interesting to you, please do connect with us. My email's on the screen. I would welcome your feedback, your thoughts, your ideas, your partnership to help us drive the drastic emissions reductions that we need. So with that, thank you all for being here. We'll close here and we'll see you all again very soon. Take care now.